Deep within the dreaded expanse of the Eye of Terror, a great war party would soon embark. This hated region of space, a churning rift in the warp, and within it was home to the forces of chaos and their dark masters, the ruinous powers. Normally, these twisted factions were consumed by infighting, driven by their fractious and treacherous natures. Yet, from time to time, the unthinkable occurred. Their rivalries were set aside, and they united under the banner of Chaos Undivided. Their combined wrath directed at their eternal enemy, the Imperium of Man. The spark that ignited this rare unity was the arrival of the Space Hulk, Devourer of Stars. This ancient and twisted vessel drifted into orbit around a demon world within the Eye of Terror, a planet ruled by the demon prince and former Primarch Angron, alongside his bloodthirsty World Eaters Traitor Legion. For 10 millennia, Angron had sought to impose some order of semblance upon the shattered remnants of what was once his mighty 12th Legion of Space Marines. But the World Eaters, driven mad by their devotion to the blood god Khorne, had long since devolved into a chaotic rabble of Khornate berserkers. Their lust for slaughter made them as likely to turn their weapons on one another as on their true enemies. The arrival of the Devourer of Stars was a gift that Angron could not ignore. The Space Hulk, massive beyond comprehension, provided the perfect opportunity to rally his fragmented forces. It was large enough to transport legions of Chaos troops. Yet its passage through real space was erratic and unpredictable, governed by the turbulent currents of the warp. It was aboard this cursed vessel that the forces of chaos emerged unexpectedly and violently into the Armageddon system in the year 444 of the 41st millennium. Angron's arrival at Armageddon was likely not completely his choice. The chaotic currents of the warp had flung the Devourer of Stars there, possibly at the whim of Khorne himself. But whether by divine intent or random chance, the Primarch and his followers descended upon the unsuspecting world. At the same time, Armageddon itself was already simmering with unrest. A series of strange and foreboding events culminated in rebellion. Half a dozen of the planet's sprawling hive cities rose up in armed defiance of Imperial rule. Their citizens whipped into a frenzy by chaos cultists exploiting food shortages caused by the warp storms. While the rebellion was swiftly crushed in the eastern region of the southern subcontinent known as Armageddon Secundus, the scattered hives of the western region on the northern subcontinent of Armageddon Prime proved far more troublesome. The Planetary Defense Forces, or PDF, and a handful of regiments from the Armageddon Steel Legion fought tirelessly to suppress the rebellion. Confident in their ability to handle the situation, the Imperium dispatched no additional forces, particularly once the warp storms had cleared. After all, Armageddon was far from the Eye of Terror, buried deep within the Segmentum Obscurus, and no one suspected that the revolts were anything more than localized civil unrest. And so, the defenders of Armageddon were unprepared when the Devourer of Stars erupted from the warp. The Space Hulk's arrival brought with it not just Angron and his berserker world eaters, but the full, unholy fury of chaos itself. The war that followed would be etched into the bloody history of the Imperium forever. Aboard the Devourer of Stars, a vast and terrible army had gathered, its ranks swelling with the bloodthirsty legions of chaos. At its head stood the demon Primarch Angron, his towering form wreathed in unholy energy, his fury an unstoppable force. And he was not alone. Millions of fanatical chaos cultists, known as the Children of Sanguinary Unholiness, chanted praises to the ruinous powers, their devotion to the dark gods absolute. Among them were the 12, the Curor Praetoria, the most exalted of Khorne's demonic champions. These 12 horrors, whose lives and deeds had most pleased their savage deity, stood as towering embodiments of carnage and slaughter. Alongside them, the relentless Chaos Space Marines of the World Eater's legions readied their weapons, their bloodlust insatiable. And from the abyssal depths of the warp, countless other demonic creatures, all sworn to the blood god's eternal war, seethed with anticipation. When the Space Hulk had at last vomited its forces onto the surface of Armageddon, the land itself trembled beneath the weight of invasion. Like a crimson tide, the warriors of chaos surged forward, unstoppable and unrelenting. But the corruption of chaos did not spread only through the blade. It worked its will through treachery and deceit as well. As the battle began, nearly half of Armageddon's planetary defense force turned against their own, swearing fealty to the very invaders they had once vowed to fight. Their sudden betrayal shattered the loyalist resistance, leaving the defenders of Armageddon Prime utterly outmatched. With no choice but to retreat, the surviving loyalist forces fell back, pushing through the suffocating heat and tangled undergrowth of the equatorial jungles. Their destination was Armageddon Secundus, where the remnants of the Imperial PDF stood. There, along the banks of the Styx and Charon rivers, the last defenders of the world prepared for a desperate stand against the tides of chaos. The war for Armageddon had only just begun. The Imperial defense was swift and disciplined, a fortress of steel and strategy against the oncoming tide of chaos. Unbeknownst to Angron and his bloodthirsty horde, fate had already set a counterstroke in motion. Assigned to this sector of the Imperium, the great company of Space Wolves, led by the legendary Great Wolf Logan Grimnar, received the desperate astropathic distress calls from Armageddon. Without hesitation, the Space Wolves answered. With the speed of the Allfather's chosen, the sons of Fenris raced to reinforce the beleaguered defenders, bringing with them the fury of the Emperor's wrath. Yet fortune for a time favored the Imperium. Rather than pressing his advantage, Angron chose instead to indulge his savage thirst for slaughter. The Demon Prince paused to raise gruesome monuments to Khorne, sculptured from the shattered remnants of the dead. This delay proved costly. By the time his forces emerged from the equatorial jungles that separated Armageddon Prime from Armageddon Secundus, the defenders were no longer scrambling to hold their ground. They were ready, and they were not alone. The Space Wolves stood among them, their bolters roaring like thunder, their howls echoing throughout the battle lines. Across the entire front, war erupted with terrifying ferocity. In the east, along the banks of the Karen River, the Imperial forces held fast, refusing to yield an inch of ground to the oncoming hordes. But in the west, along the Styx River, the battle took a darker turn. There, Angron himself led the charge, his fury a storm that no mortal line could withstand. The Blood God's chosen tore through the Imperial defenses like a blade through paper, shattering the lines in a tide of carnage. The path to Hive Infernus and Hive Hell's Reach lay open before him. Nothing short of a miracle would stop the tide of chaos from consuming them. Now was when Logan Grimnar played his final and hidden card. From the moment he had learned of the enemy they faced, he had called for the only warriors in the Imperium truly capable of banishing such a monstrous foe. The Grey Knights, the Emperor's secret weapon against the demonic, and they had answered. Few in the Imperium even knew of their existence, for chaos itself was a forbidden truth, one of the most closely guarded secrets of mankind. Even among the Space Marines, knowledge of the Grey Knights was rare. Logan Grimnar was no ordinary Astartes. He had seen them fight before, and unlike most who had borne witness to their battles, he had never been forced to submit to the mind wipes required to preserve their secrecy. He knew what they were capable of, and he knew they were the only ones who could stand against Angron. Among the Grey Knights deployed to Armageddon was Squad Castian, who had joined an ad hoc force known as the Ragged Brotherhood, assembled under the command of Taramer Aurelian, the brother captain of the Third Brotherhood. When the moment came, the Grey Knights did not march. They struck like a hammer from the heavens, teleporting directly into the heart of the advancing Chaos hordes. Their target was singular: the demon Primarch himself. The battle was brutal. Angron, a whirlwind of destruction, cut through the Grey Knights with terrifying ease, his raw power dwarfing even the might of the Emperor's chosen demon hunters. The Grey Knights paid dearly in blood, but they gave as good as they got. Squad Castian, refusing to yield, engaged the Primarch in melee. And one by one, they fell. Their skill and faith not enough to overcome the pure, unrelenting rage of the Blood God's favored son. In the end, only one stood against the beast: Imperium, a pyrokine, a master of the Emperor's cleansing flame. With his last remaining strength, and in a staggering display of faith and power, he focused his psychic might upon Angron's weapon, the dreaded Black Blade, a coronate relic of unfathomable corruption. The air burned, the warp howled, and with a final, desperate effort, Hyperion shattered the demon blade. The explosion of energy sent him crashing into the darkness. Unconscious, his body broken, but his will victorious. The moment of weakness was all that was needed. Captain Aurelian stepped forward, and with grim determination, he faced the now bladeless demon Primarch of Khorne. With a final act of sacrifice, he channeled his full might and banished Angron back into the warp. The battle was won, though the cost had been devastating. Of the 109 Grey Knights of the Third Brotherhood that had stepped foot on Armageddon, only 13 survived. Among them was Hyperion, later found on the battlefield by the Space Wolves, barely clinging to life. His feat earned him the honorific Blade Breaker, though he would spend months in stasis and undergo extensive augmetic reconstruction before returning to duty. With their leader cast back into the abyss, the forces of chaos crumbled. At the very moment the Grey Knights struck, the Space Wolves launched a massive counterattack along the Imperial lines. The enemy broke, their ranks shattered. Only the World Eaters, ever stubborn in their madness, managed to retreat to the Devourer of Stars and escape into the warp's dark embrace. The Imperium had triumphed. It was an absolute victory. But the scars of battle, both seen and unseen, would linger for generations to come. With their leader banished, and the Chaos hordes crumbling into disarray, the savage unity that had bound them under Angron's brutal will had shattered in an instant, replaced by the discord and madness that defined them. The remnants of the Chaos force at the River Charon, once poised to overrun the Imperial defenders, now turned and fled as the Space Wolves unleashed their counterattack. The Sons of Russ pursued them without hesitation, their bolters roaring and their blades drinking deep of corrupted flesh. Across the vast, poisoned expanse of the ash wastes, the retreating forces of chaos found no sanctuary. Hunted relentlessly by the combined might of the Space Wolves and the mechanized divisions of the Armageddon Steel Legion, thousands of chaos cultists, mutants, and traitor guardsmen were cut down without mercy. The taint of the ruinous powers would not be suffered to linger. Those who managed to survive the merciless pursuit fell at Minos Bridge, where they made their last desperate stand. But there would be no salvation. The Imperium offered no quarter, and the slaughter was absolute. When the battle was done, their broken bodies were cast into the river Minos, their corpses set alight in a great inferno, a funeral pyre so vast that it turned the night sky red and could be seen for hundreds of miles. The dead drifted westward, carried by the current into the festering depths of the plague marshes, a place that even now, long after the war's end, remains steeped in corruption, a wound upon the land that festers still. The Imperium had triumphed. Armageddon was saved. But victory had come at a staggering cost. The industrial heart of Armageddon Prime lay in ruins. Its factories and foundries reduced to little more than twisted wreckage. The death toll was beyond measure, a grim testament to the horrors of battle. And yet, even in defeat, the mark of chaos remained. Though Angron's army had been annihilated, his monolithic monument to the blood god still stood, untouched by time or war. Deep within the equatorial jungle it loomed, a dark, unholy relic of the slaughter that had taken place. And its malignant presence had not faded, nor had its corrupting influence waned. Even now, it calls to those who dare to listen. A beacon of inviolable evil that stains the soul of Armageddon forever. The first warning signs of trouble with the Inquisition's post-war plans emerged solar months before the war's end, during Logan Grimnar's initial meeting with the newly arrived Inquisitorial Task Force. He had no illusions about the Inquisition's need to suppress the truth of the war. Yet, he made it clear that he would not tolerate their usual suppression campaign. Given the deep-seated suspicion of the Space Wolves within the Imperial hierarchy, rooted in past disputes and their defiant disregard for Imperial authority. Grimnar's demand seemed either naive or a deliberate provocation. His manner, dismissive and firm, did little to ease tensions with the Inquisitors. But beneath his defiance lay a genuine concern for the people of Armageddon. Grimnar questioned the logic of saving a planet only to see its defenders and civilians processed by the Inquisition for the sin of witnessing chaos firsthand. To mitigate the risk, he had deliberately structured the planet's defense to limit civilian exposure to the war's darkest truths, particularly to the existence of demons and the secret forces that fought them. His strategy, however, came at a steep price. Catastrophic casualties among both the Astartes and mortal defenders. The Inquisition remained unmoved. It was, by law and the Emperor's decree, the ultimate authority in what was best for the Imperium. To them, the truth of chaos had to be contained at all costs. Better to sacrifice millions than risk an unchecked corruption that could doom billions. A lesson learned from the Horus heresy. Containing the situation on Armageddon was the only logical course of action. Conclave of Inquisitors on duty at the planet voted in favor of the Armageddon containment, a draconian measure that would see all surviving civilians sterilized and quarantined in Adeptus Arbites work camps scattered across the galaxy. Even though the populace was largely untainted and ignorant of the war's true horrors, their fate was sealed. The same grim destiny awaited the human defenders, the Armageddon Steel Legion and the Planetary Defense Forces, who had fought valiantly against chaos. Some would be purged outright. Exterminatus was ruled out, as Armageddon's industrial power was far too critical to the Imperium's war machine to be sacrificed. Overseeing the operation was Inquisitor Lord Gesme Kisnaros, commanding from the commandeered Imperial Navy battlecruiser Coral's Hope. His orders were coldly pragmatic. Better to sterilize or execute millions than risking chaos taking root and spreading unchecked. As the war neared its end, despite Grimnar's loud objections, broadcasted to all Imperial forces, the Inquisition began executing the first phase of containment. Inquisitorial stormtroopers swarmed the hive cities, rounding up civilians under the guise of temporary security measures and administering vaccinations that were in reality sterilization injections. The planet's human defenders, including over 1 million Imperial guardsmen sent for mop-up operations after Angron's banishment, were ordered into barracks to await their own processing. The Space Wolves resisted but subtly. Outnumbered on the ground by more than 100,000 inquisitorial stormtroopers and their forces, they could not openly defy the Inquisition, but in orbit, they held the advantage. 16 warships against the Inquisition's 12. Their vessels larger, better armored, and more heavily armed. Grimnar devised a desperate plan to escort transports carrying Armageddon survivors to safety. 20 such transports, waiting in orbit, stood ready to make their jump into the warp. The first ship, the Trident of Vilmatha, carrying both defenders and civilians, set course for the system's warp jump point, protected by the Space Wolves frigate Runefire. It never made the jump. The Grey Knight's frigate, Carabella, disabled its warp drive before scuttling the vessel, condemning all 400,000 passengers to their deaths. These were the opening shots and first casualties of a brutal conflict to come. The Space Wolves did not retaliate. Grimnar, unwilling to escalate the fight just yet, chose to wait and see if the Inquisition would truly go through with its purge. It was a grave miscalculation, one of many made by both sides. In response, Grimnar ordered all remaining transports to break orbit simultaneously, each one shielded by Space Wolves' warships, which positioned themselves between the transports and the Inquisition's guns. Under no circumstances were they to fire back. This way, at least some would make it to the Mandeville points and escape. Isnaros, locked in an exchange with Grimnar that devolved into insults and dire threats, was not deterred. He commanded his fleet to open fire, targeting both the interfering Space Wolf escorts and the transports themselves. But before his orders could be fully carried out, reinforcements arrived. The battle barge Gilferheim and its fleet translated into the system, tipping the balance in the Space Wolves' favor. With overwhelming naval superiority now against them, Isnaros had no choice but to stand down. Triumphant Grimnar demanded the Inquisition call off their attack. And this time, the Inquisitor Lord had no alternative. Most of the transports, along with the Armageddon survivors, escaped into the warp, escorted to safety by the Space Wolves. The battle for Armageddon was over, but the war between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition had only just begun. Though history records that the war for Armageddon began in 941 M41, its true origins stretched back nearly a decade earlier to the war-scorched surface of Urk in 932 M41. At that time, Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka was little more than a nameless orc boy, just another brutal warrior among countless greenskin hordes. But fate, or something far darker, intervened. During a skirmish with a force of space marines from an unknown chapter, a bolter shell struck Gaskell's skull, tearing through bone and flesh, blasting away a portion of his cranium and leaving him for dead. It was then that the infamous pain boy, Mad Doc Grotznick, found him. With crude but effective surgical skill, Grotznick replaced the shattered section of Gaskell's skull with a bionic implant, a device of mysterious function. Whether by some strange quirk of the implant tapping into his latent psychic powers, or through sheer madness, Gaskell awoke, changed. He spoke of visions, of whispers from the twin orc gods Gork and Mork. Whether this newfound power was real or a symptom of brain damage, none would dare challenge his claim. Within 6 Terran years, he had clawed his way to the top, crushing any who would oppose him. By 938 M41, he was war boss of his tribe. A year later, the opportunity for his grand conquest arrived. Urk's sun was dying, its violent solar flares bathing the planet in deadly radiation, killing thousands of orcs. But then salvation came in the form of a monstrous space hulk, drifting into orbit around the doomed world. Whether this was mere coincidence or some dark fate guiding his path, Gaskell saw it as a sign. With brutal determination, he rallied the 4 other orc tribes of Urk beneath his banner. He did not ask for their loyalty. He took it, uniting them through bloodshed and brute strength. Together, they boarded the Space Hulk and prepared for their greatest war yet. Their journey through the warp was anything but smooth. The ancient Hulk's power systems failed repeatedly, causing the Geller field to flicker and collapse. As the barrier between real space and the Imperium weakened, demons poured into the vessel, forcing the orcs into battle against creatures they barely understood. But they fought without fear, reveling in the carnage, earning a level of battle hardiness that would serve them well in the brutal campaign to come. Then, 1 solar month before their arrival at Armageddon, the Space Hulk, designated Alveus Alpha Alpha Sectus by the Administratum, descended upon the system like a harbinger of doom. Its sheer mass annihilated the planet's aging orbital defenses with ease, smashing through satellites and obliterating the Imperial attack craft that dared to stand against it. Desperate messages echoed through the warp as the defenders of Armageddon called for aid. Their pleas were heard, and 3 Space Marine chapters scrambled to prepare for war. But it was already too late. The storm was coming, and nothing could halt it. On the sacred day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, 941 M41, Gaskell's horde erupted from the void as their Space Hulk slammed into the surface of Armageddon. The orcs disembarked in an avalanche of green-skinned fury, their war beginning in fire and blood. The second war for Armageddon had begun. The moment the orcs landed, the sky itself seemed to turn against Armageddon. A massive warp storm erupted around the system, sealing it off from the wider Imperium. No reinforcements would come. The beleaguered defenders were on their own. As Gaskell's horde spilled across the surface, it fractured into 5 brutal tribes. 2 of them surged northward, claiming the western half of the planet's primary subcontinent, Armageddon Prime. Yet, even as war consumed the land, the planet's ruler, Overlord Hermann von Straub, remained blind to the scale of the threat. Warnings had come, whispered in the shuffle of the Emperor's tarot, muttered by Chartist captains who had seen unnatural disturbances in the warp for months. But von Straub dismissed them all. Only when the orcs were already tearing through his world did any true distress signal escape Armageddon, and even then it was not by von Straub's hand. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, an officer of the Officio Perfectus attached to the Astra Militarum regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion, defied von Straub's inaction and sent out the call for aid. For his defiance, von Straub banished Yarrick to Hades' Hive, an industrial stronghold on the subcontinent of Armageddon Secundus. As for the war itself, the Overlord convinced himself that the orcs could be held back with the planetary defense forces alone. Across Armageddon Prime, the Hive cities braced for the storm. The people formed militias, raised barricades, and entrenched themselves behind defensive lines. But nothing could halt the green-skinned tide. With each battle, the orcs smashed through, pushing the defenders further and further back. Von Straub, unwilling to concede the need for strategy, threw his soldiers into the fight disjointed and in desperate attacks that only led to more needless slaughter. From his exile in Hades' Hive, Yarrick refused to stand idle. He orchestrated daring shuttle runs to ferry weapons and supplies to the north, where the civilians fought there for survival. Imperial pilots skipped in and out of the atmosphere, trying to avoid the orcs' crude but deadly anti-air fire. Many never returned. Their burning wreckage fell like meteors onto the war-torn world. Then, when it became clear that nothing could stem this tide, von Straub abandoned the north entirely. He fled south, establishing his command in Hive Tartarus, deep within Armageddon Secundus. He knew the northern cities were doomed, but he still clung to the belief that victory could be his. Yet, even as he plotted his counterstrike, another threat loomed. 3 of the orc tribes had vanished, their movements unaccounted for. Princeps Prime Curtis Mannheim of the Legio Metallica Titan Legion, temporarily stationed on Armageddon, urged von Straub to prepare for an attack. He warned that the missing warbands were not in reserve, but were on the move, seeking a path to strike. But von Straub scoffed. He had convinced himself that the orcs would never be able to cross the equatorial jungles that divided Armageddon Prime from Secundus. He dismissed the danger, his mind consumed instead by visions of his own glorious counterattack. But unbeknownst to him, the storm was far from over. 2 days later, just as Princeps Prime Mannheim had foreseen, the orcs struck, and the horde surged into Armageddon Secundus. It was the season of storms, and the planet itself seemed to rage against the conflict. Volcanoes erupted in fury, choking the sky with black clouds. Beneath the storm-darkened heavens, the orcs came in an unstoppable tide. Massive armored columns smashed through the fragile Imperial lines. 2 tribes veered east of the Palatus Mountains, marching upon Hive Hades, while another barreled west toward Hive Hellsreach. Desperation drove von Straub to order the Titans of Legio Metallica into battle. Under Mannheim's command, they were the Imperium's greatest war machines, each the size of a city, striding behemoths of destruction. But Mannheim, a seasoned warrior, counseled caution. He urged von Straub to hold back, to fight a war of attrition. But the governor would hear none of it. His voice rose to a furious scream. He needed no help, he claimed, no patience, no strategy. He needed only victory. Mannheim, bound by duty, had no choice but to obey. He bid farewell to his family and led his Titans into the Inferno. The battle was cataclysmic. The Titans waded into the orc ranks, their weapons spitting death, trampling thousands of greenskins underfoot. But at the heart of the Wa stood the orcs' own monstrous war machines, the Gargants, crude but terrifying imitations of the Emperor's god machines. They met the Titans in brutal duels of fire and steel, and one by one, the mighty war engines of the Imperium fell. Mannheim saw the tide turning. His legion was being torn apart, yet he could not retreat. Instead, he led the remnants of Legio Metallica and their Skitarii escorts straight into the orc horde. 6 million greenskin warriors closed in, their Gargants towering above them. In the chaos of battle, Mannheim's Titan, Steel Hammer, engaged a Gargant in a vicious grinding duel and slew the beast. But the orcs were endless. Wounded, surrounded, his war machine failing, Mannheim made his final decision. With grim resolve, he triggered Steel Hammer's self-destruct sequence. The explosion consumed him, obliterated 2 more Gargants, and carved the heart out of the orc offensive. The battlefield burned, and for the first time, the orcs staggered. His sacrifice had cost them dearly, and for his heroism, Mannheim would be posthumously awarded the Emperor's Star. But the Imperium was far from saved. With the Titans gone, the Imperials had lost their strongest shield. The defenders of Armageddon Secundus retreated, rallying along the rivers, the Styges in the west, a Diabolist in the east. They dug in, hoping to hold. But when the storms lifted, the orcs came again, sweeping south in an unstoppable wave. Hive and Furnace fell without a fight, its commanding officer gripped by fear and despair, surrendered without firing a single shot. What followed was a nightmare. Refugee columns stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the burning desert, but they did not escape. The orcs' speed freak warbands descended upon them like predators, circling, striking, cutting down those who ran. They corralled the terrified masses and drove them back into the clutches of the greenskins. Hive and Furnace became a vast factory of suffering, its people enslaved to fuel the orc war machine. The Imperium had suffered a crushing defeat. The war for Armageddon was far from over, but for those who had fallen into the hands of the orcs, it had already been lost. The siege of Hades' Hive had begun. The orcs gathered in the thousands, their monstrous war machines looming in the distance. Their crude but devastating artillery pounding the Hive's defenses. Within the city's steel walls, the people of Hades fought for survival, their spirit bound to a single figure, Commissar Sebastian Yarick. Yarick was everywhere. One moment, he was at the great blast portals, helping weld them shut before the orcs could breach them. The next, he was deep in the Underhive, negotiating uneasy alliances with the city's gangs. Against all odds, he forged an army from desperate men and women, hive gangers, remnants of the Steel Legion, and civilians with nothing left to lose. They had no supply lines, little power, and their rations dwindled to rats and roaches. But Yarick would not let them break. In the darkness of his private bunker, Overlord von Straub brooded. His world was slipping from his grasp, and in his desperation, he turned to a secret weapon long hidden by his family. Ancient virus bombs, remnants from a time before memory, when Armageddon first stood against annihilation. These missiles, mounted on rusting launchers, were a last resort. But time had eroded their terrible power. Many failed to launch. Others detonated improperly. And the dreaded Life Eater virus had withered with age. Though the orcs suffered losses, it was nowhere near enough to halt the invasion. Von Straub, humiliated, withdrew deeper into his fortress, leaving the fate of his world to others. To the west, in Hive Hell's Reach, another battle raged. Inspired by Yarick's defiance, the city's defenders fought with unmatched ferocity. Street gangs turned their homes into death traps, ambushing orcs at every corner. Improvised explosives turned alleyways into slaughterhouses. The towering oil supertanks, once the lifeblood of Hell's Reach's industry, were repurposed as makeshift transports, ferrying civilians to waiting ships in the dockyards of Grindel's Lock. But the ships were not enough. The people cast lots for their survival, and those left behind knew their fate was sealed. With no hope of escape, they chose to die on their own terms. Suicide bombers strapped explosives to their chests and hurled themselves into the orc ranks, detonating among the greenskins in fiery defiance. And then there were the dock workers. They welded themselves into the massive cargo cranes, turning them into improvised war machines, swinging their enormous arms to smash into the towering orc gargants. For a moment, it seemed as if the orcs might falter, that the cost of taking Hell's Reach would be too great even for them. But then, the Weird Boys came. Gathering their unnatural power, the orc psychers unleashed a devastating psychic assault. A wave of raw, malevolent energy swept through the city, shattering the minds of every remaining human defender. And like that, the battle was over. Hell's Reach belonged to the orcs. But Hades' hive still stood. Gazkul himself arrived at the front, his massive frame bristling with crude yet devastating weaponry. The warlord of the orcs surveyed the unbroken city and knew that he had found a worthy challenge. He tried everything. Elite commandos rappelling down from the hive's spires, massive siege weapons designed to shatter its walls, even gargants retrofitted with massive earth-moving devices meant to tear through the city's defenses. Each attempt was met with failure. For every cunning trick Gazkul devised, Yarick had an answer. Rappelling commandos slipped into the hive's ventilation shafts, only to be met by maintenance crews armed with nothing but bolt pistols and knives. Not a single greenskin emerged alive. When the orcs feinted to draw the defenders away, Yarick used the hive's transport network to counter every move. Suicide bombers crept beyond the walls, slipping into enemy encampments and reducing their siege weapons to twisted wreckage. Hades would not fall, not while Yarick still drew breath. As the siege of Hades' hive raged on, the war spread. From the fallen ruins of Hell's Reach and the enslaved depths of Infernus, orc warbands surged south, their sights set on Hive Acheron. To the embattled defenders of the last bastion of human resistance, it felt as though the storm of war was about to consume them whole. From their watchtowers and flickering ocular monitors, the Archarians could see the endless green tide advancing towards them. Their governor rallied them with fiery words, vowing that they would never surrender. But morale alone would not stop the horde. The only reinforcements they had received from Overlord Van Straub were his hollow reassurances and 20 members of his personal guard, the ones he disliked the most. Then, just as the orcs prepared to breach the outer hive, the sky split apart. Explosions ripped through the orc ranks, tearing their ramshackle war machines into flaming wreckage. The greenskin advance halted in utter confusion as the defenders of Acheron looked on in disbelief. From the heavens, Imperial aircraft roared into view, their silhouettes unmistakable. Thunderhawk gunships, the harbingers of the Emperor's fury. The Adeptus Astartes had come. Space Marines descended into righteous fury, their ceramite boots shaking the battlefield as bolters thundered against the orc tide. The orcs reeled in shock, unused to the sight of warriors who could meet them in raw savagery and surpass them in discipline and might. The defenders of Hive Acheron, emboldened by this miracle, poured from their barricades to join the fight. For the first time since the war had begun, the orcs knew defeat. The Space Marines wasted no time in securing the hive. A command post was established, and across the battered city, banners of the Adeptus Astartes flew once more. But their arrival was not welcomed by all. From the safety of his bunker, Overlord Von Straub, ever the coward, railed against their interference. He insisted he had everything under control, but his protests fell on deaf ears. The force commander of the Blood Angels chapter, none other than Commander Dante himself, took immediate command of all remaining Imperial forces. With a voice like iron, he declared Von Straub under arrest for negligence, assassination, and murder. Von Straub, unwilling to face judgment, attempted to flee. His land speeder was later found wrecked in the wastelands beyond the hive. His body never recovered. But while the tide of war had shifted in the south, the north still drowned under the weight of orc aggression. Warlord Ghazghkull had not relented in his siege of Hive Hades. His war machine grew stronger. His forces swelled with each passing day. The unyielding spirit of Hades, once a beacon of defiance, was beginning to falter. Food had run dry. Once, Hades had supplied the rest of the world, its factories and fields sustaining the defenders of Armageddon. Now the flow had reversed, and desperate shipments came south, struggling to keep the hive from starvation. Yet, no amount of aid could lift the shadow of despair settling over the city. The people of Hades felt the weight of impending doom pressing down upon them. A terror that even the indomitable Commissar Yarick could not drive from their hearts. The orcs were coming, and this time there would be no stopping them. Lord Commander Dante knew that if the Imperium had any chance of breaking the orc war machine, they had to strike at its head. He devised a daring gambit, an all-out assault to capture Ghazghkull Thraka himself. The Blood Angels would be deployed deep behind enemy lines, storming the warlord's headquarters in a swift and brutal strike. If they could remove Ghazghkull from the battle, the greenskin horde would crumble. But fate had other plans. By sheer chance, Ghazghkull was not in his headquarters that day. He was at the front, overseeing his armies, reveling in the carnage. Though the Orc warlord escaped the trap, the Blood Angels still left their mark. Their sudden strike tore through the Orc's spearhead, dealing a devastating blow to the Horde's momentum. Meanwhile, the battle for Hive Tartarus erupted into one of the bloodiest engagements of the war. The city became a charnel house as Orcs and Imperial forces clashed in close-quarters combat. The streets ran slick with blood as the two sides tore into each other with savage abandon. Time and again, the Orcs attempted to break out, but each time they were forced back by the narrowest of margins. As the days of relentless slaughter dragged on, the Orcs found themselves pushed to the brink. Their supplies dwindled to nothing. Their guns ran dry. Starving and desperate, they abandoned their crude firearms and fought like cornered beasts, wielding knives, rocks, anything they could find. But even their feral fury could not change the tide, and one by one, they fell. Some whispered that Ghazghkull had met his end that day, that a single bolter shell had struck the bionic half of his skull and felled him at last. But when the dust settled, no body was found. And though the Imperium celebrated, believing the warlord slain, the truth would become clear soon enough. Ghazghkull Thraka had survived. But for now, the battle was won. With the fall of Hive Tartarus, the Second War for Armageddon came to its end. Leaderless and shattered, the Orc horde collapsed. Half their number lay dead on the scorched battlefields, and the survivors fled into the equatorial jungles, where, deprived of their war machines, they slowly devolved into primitive savagery. From that moment forward, the fate of Armageddon was sealed. The Imperium had held the line. The world remained in human hands. But deep in the darkness of the jungles, the embers of war still smoldered, waiting to ignite once again. As the war in the south reached its climax with the brutal battle for Hive Tartarus, the conflict on Armageddon Prime raged on, ignited anew by the arrival of Imperial reinforcements. With the warp storm finally dissipated, the Imperium's might surged into the war-torn system. Among the new arrivals was an unexpected but formidable force, an army of mercenary squats, battle-hardened warriors of the Leagues of Votan, led by Inquisitor Horst of the Ordo Xenos. Horst had won their loyalty in the crucible of battle on the mining world of Golgotha, where he fought alongside them against a mutual enemy. In gratitude for his aid, the squats had pledged their service and now, upon arriving on Armageddon, they were swiftly directed to the embattled northern regions to bolster the Imperial defenses. But these warriors were not here merely to hold a line. As Hive Tartarus fell and the tide of war shifted in the Imperium's favor, Horst led his squat forces on a relentless counter-offensive. With grim determination, they surged forward, driving the shattered remains of the orc horde back toward the equatorial jungles. The squats unleashed the full power of their formidable war machines, mighty land fortresses, ancient behemoths of destruction, rolling across the battlefield like mobile citadels. Their massive cannons roared, sending fire and death into the fleeing greenskins. For the orcs there was no refuge, no chance to regroup. The Imperium had seized the momentum, and now, with the fury of the squats bearing down upon them, the greenskins had no choice but to retreat into the dense, unforgiving jungles where their mighty Wa would wither and fade. At last, an Imperial relief force surged north toward Hive Hades, a mighty contingent drawn from the Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders. 3 noble Space Marine chapters that had answered Armageddon's desperate call for aid once the warp storm had finally lifted. But their arrival came too late. By the time they reached the once proud Hive City, it had already fallen to the orcs. The defenders had fought to the bitter end, their lines crushed beneath the sheer, unrelenting tide of greenskin warriors. The streets of Hades were nothing more than a charnel house of shattered defenses and butchered Imperial soldiers. Few had survived. And yet, amidst the ruin, the Astartes found one man still standing. Commissar Sebastian Yarick, bloodied and broken, but unbowed, was discovered amidst the corpses of dozens of orcs, his battered chainsword still clutched in his hands. Though the Hive had fallen, he had endured, a living testament to the ferocity of the defenders and the price they had exacted from their enemies. Meanwhile, to the west, the war refused to die. A new wave of orc reinforcements crashed into the battlefield, surging toward Hive Tartarus in a desperate attempt to shatter the Imperial counteroffensive. The defenders in the western regions had already been stripped of their strength for the doomed battle at Hive Hades, and the greenskins cut through their weakened lines like a scythe through wheat. At their head was none other than Ghazghkull himself. The warlord had returned, undeterred by his supposed death, leading his warriors in one last ruthless attempt to seize Armageddon once and for all. The orcs smashed through the Imperial defenses at the Skeletus River, threatening to undo all that had been gained. For a moment, it seemed as if victory might yet slip from the Imperium's grasp. But the Emperor's angels of death would not allow it. With relentless fury, the combined might of the Space Marine chapter struck back, driving the orcs into a desperate retreat. The greenskins were pushed back to Armageddon Prime, their strength broken, their war machines burning in the desert sands. For 12 more Terran years, sporadic fighting raged on, but the orcs had lost their momentum. Their numbers dwindled, their war effort collapsed, and eventually they were forced to abandon the world they had fought so hard to claim. In 961 M41, the last of Ghazghkul's surviving warriors fled aboard newly constructed void ships, escaping the system at last. The Second War for Armageddon was over. The Imperium had prevailed. But for Ghazghkul, this was no defeat. The fire of war still burned in his heart. He had seen the measure of the Imperium's might, tested its steel, and found it worthy. He did not retreat in shame. He withdrew with purpose, his mind consumed by a single, unshakable desire: a rematch. And it would come exactly 57 standard years to the day after the war had begun. Armageddon, a vast industrial colossus of the Imperium, stood as a pillar of mankind's dominion in the Segmentum Solar, a hive world teeming with life. Its population numbered between 100 and 500 billion souls. A staggering mass of humanity toiling under the ever-churning machinery of industry and war. Its factories belched smoke into the skies, forging the weapons, armor, and munitions that fed the Imperium's relentless war machine. Such was its importance that its continued existence was not merely a matter of pride, but of survival for the tightly packed worlds, the heart of human space. It was here, in this vital bastion of Imperial might, that war returned once more. The Third War for Armageddon erupted precisely 57 standard years to the day after the Second War had begun, in 998 M41. And it came with an enemy whose hatred for the Imperium burned as fiercely as the forges of Armageddon itself. Ghazghkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the warlord whose name sent shivers through even the most battle-hardened Imperial commanders, had returned. The infamous orc leader had not come alone. 3 mighty warlords stood alongside him, each commanding their own ravenous hordes. The great despot of Draegruk, Urgok the Unstoppable, and the overfiend of Octarius led vast greenskin legions, each one a force capable of laying waste to entire worlds. Together, they had assembled what would become the greatest orc Waaagh the Imperium had ever faced. But Ghazghkul was no ordinary orc. He was something far more dangerous. He possessed not just the brute strength and savagery of his kind, but true cunning, vision, and the will to unite the ever-warring orc tribes under a single, devastating purpose. As a young orc, a grievous head injury had unlocked something within him. Visions sent by the orc gods Gork and Mork themselves. Whether divine insight or madness, it drove him down a path of conquest unmatched by any of his kind in recent history. His return to Armageddon was no mere whim of fate. This was a rematch, long planned and methodically prepared. Decades of raids, skirmishes, and relentless testing of the Imperium's defenses had culminated in this moment. He had done the impossible, unifying dozens of orc tribes, even drawing contingents from rival orc empires. Never before had the Imperium faced such an overwhelming tide of greenskins, their war cries shaking the heavens as they descended upon the world. Armageddon, the forge world of humanity, would once again become a battlefield. But this time, the storm that fell upon it was unlike any that had come before. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka had not spent the years after the Second War for Armageddon nursing his wounds in defeat. No, the war boss had never considered himself defeated at all. While the Imperium believed it had triumphed, Gazkul simply withdrew to his stronghold, a vast network of orc-controlled star systems in the Golgotha sector. There, he continued to follow the grand vision that had been bestowed upon him by the gods Gork and Mork decades before. The Imperium's greatest mistake had not been failing to kill him. It had been believing that the war was over. Gazkul's defeat had been nothing more than a lesson, a chance to study his enemy. The visions from his gods had given him a simple but brutal truth. To destroy one's foe completely, one must first understand them. To Gazkul, the Second War for Armageddon had been nothing more than a test, a way to learn how the Imperium would respond to a full-scale orc planetary invasion. Now, with the knowledge in hand, he was ready to perfect his craft. For 5 solar decades, Gazkul worked tirelessly, refining his tactics, shaping his armies, and preparing for his true war. He could not afford to draw the full might of the Imperium upon himself too soon, so he honed his strategy in secret. Between 945 and 959 M41, scattered reports of small orc raids and skirmishes reached Imperial commanders. These were no random greenskin assaults. They were experiments, each one personally overseen by Gazkul himself. Then, in 962 M41, the true scope of his cunning became apparent. On the world of Buka III, an Imperial military base was reduced to ruin, not by a direct orc attack, but by missiles launched from an asteroid. The rock had drifted in from deep space, slipping past Imperial sensors, unnoticed, before revealing its true nature. By the time the defenders realized the threat, it was far too late. 10 years later, in 972 M41, Gazkul's forces struck again. This time, the agri-world of Chigon 17 fell under his command. Despite the defenders' armored might, tanks, heavy artillery, and entrenched positions, the orcs did not charge in reckless waves as they so often did. Instead, they waged a brutal guerrilla war, adapting to the battlefield in ways Imperial strategists had never seen before. The Imperial Guard, bound by their static defenses, were helpless against the relentless and mobile orc assault. The attacks did not stop there. In 986 M41, the Imperial Navy battlecruiser Radiant Way and its entire escort fleet vanished without a trace, lost to the void in an ambush by orc pirates. The Imperium responded swiftly, sending warships to hunt down the greenskins responsible, only to find nothing. The orcs had vanished, as if they had never been there at all. Then, in the final days before the storm of war returned to Armageddon, Ghazghkull made his boldest move yet. He allied with the powerful Bad Moon's warlord, Nazdreg Ugg Erdgrub, and together they launched an assault on the Imperial world of Piscina IV. But this was no ordinary invasion. The orcs employed an entirely new form of teleportation technology, hurling their forces directly onto the planet's surface from a distant space hulk. The defenders were caught entirely off guard, and had it not been for the swift and brutal intervention of the Dark Angel Space Marine chapter, the world would have been lost. Yet, even this setback meant little to Ghazghkull. The battle had served its purpose. The new teleporter technology, crafted by the orc genius, later dubbed Orchimedes by the Imperium, had been tested, and it had worked. Now, after more than 50 years of preparation, the final pieces were in place. Ghazghkull had learned all he needed. His war machine was ready, and the time for revenge had come. In the aftermath of Ghazghkull's first brutal invasion of Armageddon, the Imperium took no chances. The world had barely survived the onslaught, and the lesson was clear. Armageddon had to be fortified like never before. In 948 M41, the Adeptus Terra launched an extensive investigation into the planet's readiness and defenses, determined to ensure that such devastation could never happen again. The measures were drastic but necessary. The Imperial Navy's sector command was transferred to the Armageddon system itself, bringing with it the full might of the Emperor's warships. The naval station of St. Jowen's Dock, once reduced to ruin, was not only rebuilt, but expanded, capable now of servicing all classes of Imperial warships. 3 newly established monitoring stations, named in honor of the greatest heroes of the Second War for Armageddon, Mannheim, Dante, and Yorick, stood watch at the system's edge, ever vigilant for threats lurking in the void. But the defenses did not stop there. Orbital and ground-based fortifications were reinforced beyond anything seen before. Deadly gravitic minefields were sown throughout the system's approaches, and a fleet of sublight defense ships and monitors patrolled the vast expanse of space. Armageddon would not be caught unprepared again. On the surface, the scars of war remained. The hive cities, shattered and burned by Ghazghkul's war machines, were slowly rebuilt. A monumental effort that even 5 decades later remained unfinished. Progress was slow, in part due to the increased demand for new planetary defense force regiments. Though Armageddon's tithe to the Astra Militarum had been lowered, the world itself had become a fortress, raising and training vast numbers of soldiers to stand guard over their home. Ruling over this war-hardened world was a military council appointed by the Administratum, composed of high-ranking officials from the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, the Departamento Munitorum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Ecclesiarchy, alongside the governors of the hive cities themselves. At its head stood General Kurov, a grizzled veteran of the Bacchus Crusade, a man of steel resolve who wasted no time in dealing with the lingering threat of the Greenskins. For nearly 3 decades, from 949 to 978 M41, Kurov led a relentless series of xenocidal campaigns across the equatorial jungles that separated Armageddon Prime from Secundus, as well as on the frozen wastelands of Chosin. There, the last remnants of feral orcs left behind after Ghazghkul's first invasion were hunted down and exterminated. It was a long, brutal campaign, but by the time it had ended, Armageddon had risen once more, its defenses stronger than ever before. Yet, even this would not be enough. The first whispers of doom came as scattered reports, small, almost insignificant at first. Orc pirates striking Imperial trade routes, the world of Minerva raided, its supplies plundered. Then came the agri-world of Ruiz, where the Greenskins descended in even greater numbers. Over mere months, despite the valiant efforts of the Imperial Navy, the number of merchant ships reaching Armageddon was cut in half. Someone, something, understood that the Imperium's forces were bound to the Armageddon system, forced to guard its heart, unable to freely respond to threats elsewhere. Then, the attacks escalated. The pirate raids became full-scale assaults on Imperial outposts. Lightly defended colonies were wiped out overnight. And then came the invasions. Within the span of mere hours, 24 Imperial worlds fell under attack. The astropaths of Armageddon became overwhelmed with messages of distress, pleas for aid, reports of destruction, frantic warnings of more orcs on the way. The Emperor's tarot, consulted time and again, showed only one grim fate: bloodshed beyond reckoning. And with it, the dreaded sign of the beast resurgent. The rumor spread like wildfire. Ghazghkul was returning. At first, the Administratum refused to believe it. But as the reports mounted, as more and more worlds fell to the growing Wa, even the most obstinate bureaucrats could no longer deny the truth. An orc invasion of unimaginable scale had begun, engulfing the entire Armageddon sector in its fury. When the Imperial Navy's task force Trajan vanished without a trace, lost in battle against the Orcs in the Desdina system, General Kurov knew there was no time left. Without hesitation, he sent out an astropathic call for aid, summoning Astra Militarum regiments and the Emperor's Angels of Death, the Space Marines, to Armageddon's defense once more. The storm was coming, and this time it would be like nothing the Imperium had ever faced. On the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 998 M41, 57 years to the day since the first Orc invasion of Armageddon, disaster struck once more. Deep within the void, augur psychic probes registered a massive, violent disruption in the warp. Moments later, the disturbance took form. An Orc fleet, vast beyond reckoning, tore back into real space, and in its wake came the full, terrifying force of Gaskell's greenskin horde. The first warning came from Monitor Station Dante, its Vox transmission crackling with frantic urgency. Then silence. The station was gone, wiped away mid-message as the first waves of Orc starships hurtled past in their ramshackle, brutal hundreds. Before the final signal was lost, the Imperium received its grim tally. An Orc fleet of staggering proportions was bearing down upon the Armageddon system. 50 Orc cruisers, over 300 escort ships, and at least 4 monstrous space hulks led the charge. At once, the planet's defenses roared to life. 7 Imperial Navy cruiser squadrons, commanded by Admiral Peril and led by the Apocalypse-class battleships, His Will and Triumph, launched from St. Jowen's dock within a single day of the Orcs' arrival. The battle began 5 days later, far from Armageddon itself, as the Imperial fleet sprang an ambush in the high-gravity trap of Pelekudar. It was a brutal opening salvo. 60 Orc attack ships were obliterated in the first exchange of fire. Not a single Imperial vessel was lost. But this was only the beginning. Like a tidal wave of iron and fury, the main Orc fleet surged forward. Heavy squadrons of kill cruisers and swarms of fighter bombers raced ahead of the horde, throwing themselves into the Imperial guns with reckless abandon. The disciplined fire of the Imperial fleet struck back with devastating force. Mighty broadside batteries shredded crude Orc vessels, while ravening lance beams burned entire waves of fighter bombers from the sky. Yet, for every Orc ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The numbers were overwhelming. The Greenskins outnumbered the Imperial Navy by 6 to 1. They threw themselves forward in suicidal assaults, Orc ships ramming into Imperial battle lines with brute force, tearing through with a reckless disregard for their own losses. The Imperials fought valiantly, but the tide could not be stemmed. At the height of the engagement, new horrors emerged. Desperate, Admiral Peril received urgent comm bursts from the Yark and Mannheim monitor stations. 3 more entire Orc fleets were entering the edges of the star system. Even as this news reached him, the triumph was struck. 5 kill cruisers focused their fire on the mighty battleship, their combined assault hammering through its defenses. Then came the boarders. Orc teleport strikes, wave after wave, swarming the crippled ship from within. Harrow knew what had to be done. The battle was lost. His duty was no longer victory, but survival. With great reluctance, he issued the order for a general retreat. The doomed Imperial monitor stations fell mere hours later. The last reports from their besieged crew gave the final chilling count. Over 2,000 Orc starships and at least 12 Space Hulks now filled the Armageddon system. An invasion force greater than any the Imperium had ever seen in its 10,000-year history. Peril, his once mighty fleet reduced to 5 squadrons of cruisers and a single battleship, could do little against such an overwhelming foe. He knew reinforcements would come, but until then, his fleet could only harass the enemy, striking where they could, buying time for what would be a brutal, prolonged war. His remaining vessels turned to hit-and-run attacks, setting cunning traps and leading Orc warships into deadly gravitic minefields. But their efforts revealed an even more troubling sight. Dozens of heavily armed asteroid fortresses, crude but deadly rocks lurking in the rear of the Orc formations. These floating bastions bristled with weapons, proving nearly impossible to assault directly. Worse still, their sheer number suggested something deeply unsettling. A level of Orc strategic planning far beyond anything the Imperium had encountered before. And yet, for all their strength, the Orcs did not turn to seize St. Jowan's dock. Instead, they pounded it relentlessly from afar, subjecting the station to a relentless 6-day bombardment as their fleets pushed deeper into the system. Imperial assault boat squadrons launched counterattacks wherever they could, but it was not enough. The Orcs breached the station, spreading through its lower levels like a disease. Though the dock remained under Imperial control, it was effectively crippled. Its ability to service warships rendered all but useless. Only later, as the battle for Armageddon raged on, would the Imperium strike back at the invaders within the station. It took the intervention of the Ordo Xenos elite Deathwatch Space Marine kill teams to turn the tide. Their warriors cutting through the entrenched Orc forces with ruthless precision. Pushed back, the surviving greenskins retreated deep into the isotope storage pits at the base of the dock, refusing to die without a final stand. The war had begun in full. The Armageddon system burned once more, and Gaskel's vengeance was far from finished. The final solar weeks before the Orcs set foot on Armageddon were filled with a feverish urgency. The great engines of Imperial Titans roared to life, their ancient plasma reactors burning as they took up defensive positions around the hive cities. Imperial Guard regiments drilled relentlessly, their trenches dug deep into the scorched earth, awaiting the inevitable tide of war. Across the mountains and wastelands, the warriors of over 20 Space Marine chapters gathered, sharpening their blades for the coming slaughter. The skies above were no safer. Every day, Imperial merchant vessels, hastily repurposed for war, braved the besieging Orc fleet to ferry in supplies and reinforcements. The risk was enormous, but the cost of failure greater still. Then, on the last transport to touch down before the storm truly broke, a legend returned to Armageddon. The old man himself, Imperial Commissar Yarrick, stepped onto the planet's soil for the first time in 2 decades. The people erupted in cheers. Their world was on the brink of destruction, but their greatest hero had returned to stand with them. That night, Yarrick met with the military council of Armageddon. His warnings were grave. Ghazghkull was not merely an Orc brute. He was a master of strategy, a warlord of singular cunning. Underestimating him had doomed Armageddon once before, and it would do so again if they were not prepared. General Kurov, commander renowned for his insight into the hearts of warriors, saw in Yarrick a fire and wisdom unmatched by any other. Without hesitation, he urged the Commissar to take control of the Council for the duration of the crisis. To the collective relief of all present, Yarrick agreed. 6 weeks after the Orc Armada entered the Armageddon system, the war began in earnest. The vast, green-skinned fleet descended upon the Imperial space stations and orbital defenses in a storm of fire and destruction. Those who had believed the mighty defenses of Armageddon's high orbit would hold were swiftly proven wrong. The battle raged across the void for 3 relentless days and 2 terrible nights. On the dawn of the 3rd day, the skies of Armageddon burned. Thousands of Orc landing pods rained down like falling stars, their incandescent trails streaking through the clouds. The first victim of Ghazghkull's wrath was Hive Hades. Still a ruin from the last war, it was marked not for conquest, but for annihilation. The Orc warlord did not waste time fighting over its shattered streets. Instead, the city and its inhabitants were obliterated from above. Massive asteroids hurled down from the orbiting space hulks struck Hades with cataclysmic force. A single brutal statement. Ghazghkull had returned, and mercy was not in his nature. As the eastern horizon burned with the death of Hades, the first Orc drop legions clashed with Imperial defenders near Vulcanus, Acheron, and Deathmire. Ground-based defense lasers and missile silos tore through the Orc landing craft with brutal efficiency. But still, the hulking warriors emerged from the wreckage, regrouping and surging forward with relentless fury. Feral Orcs, long hidden in the Palladus Mountains and equatorial jungles, came howling from their wilderness homes to join their technologically advanced kin in battle. Where the planetary defenses proved too strong, Orc war machines and warriors were teleported directly from the space hulks above, bypassing the fortifications entirely. By the third day, the last of the planet's ground defenses had fallen silent. The orcs had secured their foothold. In a final act of desperation, Yarick issued a desperate order. Every remaining Imperial aircraft was to take to the skies, launching a full-scale assault on the landing orc forces before they could reinforce their positions. The skies over Armageddon became a frenzied maelstrom of battle. Orc fighter bombers and Imperial thunderbolts and furies wove through the air, their twisting trails of smoke and fire crisscrossing like threads of a deadly tapestry. The Imperium's pilots held the advantage at first. Their aircraft could return to fortified air bases to rearm, while the orcs had to conserve fuel to return to their ships. But soon, the Greenskins established makeshift landing strips on the surface, and with them came an overwhelming flood of aircraft. By sheer, brutal numbers, the balance of power in the skies shifted. 5 days after the landings began, Hive Acheron fell, not to battle, but to treachery. Without warning, its power grid was sabotaged, and from deep within the hive, hidden tunnels burst open, spewing forth orc warriors from the very heart of the city. The architect of this betrayal soon revealed himself, the infamous war criminal and disgraced former planetary governor, Hermann von Straub. Seizing the city as his own, he declared himself its rightful overlord. His rule was absolute. Those who dared to defy him quickly learned the price, as orc brute squads enforced his command without hesitation. Even more shocking was the reaction of Acheron's old nobility. Rather than reject the traitor, many welcomed him back with open arms, choosing to ignore the alien monsters at his side in favor of reclaiming their lost prince. While the rest of Armageddon fought for survival, Acheron had already been lost to treason. That same day, Hive Volcanus faced its own nightmare. A tide of orc infantry stormed across the 20 square miles of fortifications atop Volcanus Mount, overrunning 17 regiments of Hive militia. Entire batteries of Imperial weaponry fell intact into orc hands, and soon Volcanus found itself encircled, pummeled relentlessly by its own captured artillery. Outside Deathmire, however, the defenders stood firm. The mighty titans of Legios Tempestor and Victorum, supported by the cybernetic Skitarii of the Mechanicus, clashed with the orc Blackfire tribe in a 3-day battle that left the Greenskins all but annihilated. But even their victory could not stop the tide. Orclanders continued to fall from the sky like an endless storm, and soon every hive city and factory complex on the planet was engulfed in war. Yarick's warnings proved devastatingly true. Ghazghkull's strategies were nothing short of genius. The orcs dominated the skies, their bombardments and aircraft pinning the Imperial forces down, ensuring they could not regroup or form a solid battle line. Where they were outnumbered, they fought with brutal guerrilla tactics, striking hard and vanishing into the wastelands before retribution could arrive. The Orc warlord had learned well from past failures. He ensured the fighting was scattered and chaotic, creating the exact conditions where Orc warbands thrived, while Imperial forces, reliant on coordination and structure, found themselves stretched thin and overwhelmed. Yet, there was one force that defied him, the Adeptus Astartes. The Space Marines did what no others could. Across the battlefields of Armageddon, they waged their own brutal campaign, striking into the Orc ranks with ruthless precision. Their search and destroy missions scoured the hinterlands, cutting down entire concentrations of greenskins before they could become a greater threat. The battle for Armageddon was only beginning. The war would be long. The war would be brutal. But the Imperium had not yet fallen. Not while Yarick still drew breath. And as the battle for Armageddon raged across its scorched surface, Ghazghkull revealed yet another of his brutal surprises. From the void above, dozens of massive Orc rocks, those same spaceborne fortresses that had clashed with Admiral Peril's fleet, began their descent. They tumbled through the atmosphere, their monstrous bulk slowed by crude but effective gravitic force fields, retro boosters, and the sheer force of Orc tractor cannons. A great many were blasted apart by ground defenses, or simply met their demise through typical Orky accidents. But for each one that survived, a new Orc stronghold was born. Scattered across the equatorial jungles, Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus, these makeshift citadels were more than just hulking bastions of war. Armed with enormous cannons and missile batteries, they bristled with firepower, turning entire battlefields into no man's land. Yet their true horror lay within. Colossal teleportation arrays. Creations of the twisted genius Orchimedes. With a crackle of unstable energy, these infernal devices funneled an unending stream of reinforcements from orbit. Gargants, heavy artillery, and endless waves of Orcs materialized onto the planet's surface, bolstering their forces wherever the fighting was fiercest. Commissar Yarick wasted no time. Leading the elite Cadian stormtroopers alongside the towering god machines of Legio Metallica and Legio Ignatum, he launched ferocious counterattacks against the newly entrenched Orcs. Some rocks fell beneath the might of these war engines, shattered by Titan plasma annihilators and demolisher charges placed by the brave stormtroopers. Yet for every fortress that burned, others withstood the Imperial onslaught, consuming entire regiments in brutal, desperate battles that lasted mere hours. With the Imperial Guard unable to stem the tide alone, the burden fell upon the Space Marines to break the Orc strongholds. The Salamanders, in particular, earned great renown for their victories, scouring the rocks along the Hemlock River with bolter, flame, and blade. Even as the Imperium reeled from the Orc landings, a far more unsettling mystery unfolded. Reports flooded in that orcs were making landfall in the fire wastes and the Deadlands, barren, lifeless regions long believed to be devoid of strategic value. Not even Yarick, with all his years of experience against Gaskell, could fathom why the Greenskins would waste their forces on such inhospitable terrain. The answer came weeks later. From the poisoned depths of Armageddon's oceans, hundreds of massive orc submersibles, tanker-sized behemoths of crude yet deadly design, emerged in terrifying unison. These monstrosities, another mad invention of Archimedes, surged forth, making landfall at Hive Tempestora and the dockyards of Hell's Reach. The sheer audacity of the attack caught the defenders completely unprepared. Within days, Tempestora was overrun, its defenders butchered or scattered. Hell's Reach, its once proud defenses crumbling, teetered on the brink of annihilation. Yet the Hive City did not fall so easily. The Ganger militias of Hell's Reach, hardened by a lifetime of brutal survival, stood their ground with unwavering defiance. Reinforcements arrived in the form of Imperial Guard stormtroopers and battle brothers of the Adeptus Astartes, rushed to the war zone in a desperate bid to hold the line. The battle that followed would be remembered in legend, the Battle of Hell's Reach. And at its heart stood Chaplain Grimaldus of the Black Templars, his black armor wreathed in fire and faith, leading the defense of the sacred temple of the Emperor Ascendant. It was here, in the ruins of a city turned into a war zone, that history was written in blood and fire. 14 days after the Orc invasion began, the first full-scale confrontation between Imperial and Orc war engines erupted. The battlefield, the sprawling Diabolus factory complex. The combatants, the lumbering metal-clad behemoths of two warring civilizations. On one side, the gargant mobs of Warlord Berserk and Warlord Scarfang, their rusted titans belching smoke and roaring with the fury of the Wa. On the other, the titans of Legio Crucius, imperial god machines striding into battle with weapons that could tear through mountains. For 10 days, the battle raged in relentless fury. The sky burned with las fire, plasma eruptions, and crude but devastating orc megablasts. 6 titans and 8 gargants fell, their wreckage joining the ruins of the Diabolus complex, now nothing more than a graveyard of steel and blood. Though the Imperium had altered the Orc advance here, the cost had been staggering. And worse, with the factory complex obliterated, vital production lines of war materials were lost. With Diabolus in ruins, the Orcs surged forward once more. The speed cults, ravenous for slaughter, descended upon Hive and Furnace, sealing the city in a noose of roaring engines and dust-choked death. Initial counterattacks by mechanized Imperial forces brought some success, until an entire regiment of Savlar Kimdogs found itself surrounded and annihilated. Their sacrifice was in vain. With the roads choked by orc warbikes and buggies, the defenders of Infernus found themselves trapped. As the Imperial commanders desperately sought a way to break the siege, a new terror emerged on the horizon. From the northeast, beyond the Palladis Mountains, a tide of green surged forward, a vast orc horde, stretching as far as the eye could see. A roiling, seething mass of warriors, war machines, and crude banners, filling the ash wastes with the sound of their war chants. Towering above them, like gods of war among mortals, strode the orc gargants, their cyclopean eyes glowing with hatred and destruction. But it was not their size that struck the greatest terror into the hearts of the defenders. It was the symbol emblazoned upon the banners that swayed above the horde, fluttering in the dry, corpse-scented wind. The glyph of Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. Above them, the skies darkened, not from clouds, but from the looming shadow of orc space hulks. Then, the bombardment began. Fire rained from the heavens as the orbiting warships unleashed their fury upon the hive. The ground quaked beneath the onslaught. Towers collapsed, and streets became craters. The people of Infernus, terrified and trapped, clung to the stories of Hive Hades, of Yarick's defiant stand all those years ago. But courage was a fickle thing. Thousands fled, only to be slaughtered or enslaved by the circling speed colts. Amid the chaos, the arbitrators of the Adeptus Arbites moved swiftly. There would be no cowardice in the Emperor's city. Those who ran were gunned down without hesitation, their bodies joining the countless others that lined the ruined streets. Then came silence, a brief, dreadful lull in the carnage. And from this darkness, Gazkul delivered his message. A single, mutilated figure stumbled forth, Colonel Gortar of the Kimdogs. His eyes were gone, his hands severed, his body broken almost beyond recognition. And yet, he still lived, forced to carry the words of the beast who sent him. His voice, ragged and torn, carried across the smoldering ruins. Surrender or die. It was a message the Imperium would hear many times in the days to come, for the war had only just begun. And even though the war was only just beginning, Armageddon already stood upon the brink of annihilation. But then, salvation came, clad in black and sworn to a war eternal. High Marshal Helbrecht, Supreme Commander of the Black Templars, answered the desperate call for aid. He brought with him not just warriors, but 3 full crusades of the Emperor's finest. Each one a hammer poised to strike at the heart of the orc invasion. As the battle for Armageddon raged, the Black Templars waged brutal campaigns across the planet's ashen wastelands. But it was in the void above that their greatest contribution was made. The Crusades had gathered at a chapter keep on the world of Fergax, a before setting course for the embattled system. Upon their arrival, Helbrecht's mastery of fleet warfare proved invaluable. While the marshals Ricard and Amalrich led their forces planetside, Helbrecht took command of the Adeptus Astartes fleet, directing a vicious campaign against the Orc Armada. The war in space was a bitter, grinding struggle, with Helbrecht himself leading boarding actions against monstrous Orc spacehawks. Slowly, the Imperial Navy, under the command of Admiral Peril, turned the tide, grinding down the Orc fleet and choking off reinforcements to the surface. Then came the season of fire. As the very land of Armageddon erupted into volcanic fury, the battle reached a deadly stalemate. But the Black Templars' moment of triumph was shattered by a single, terrifying foe. The Space Hulk, Malevolent Dread. This behemoth of war, crippled but not slain by earlier bombardments from the battle barge Light of Purity, still loomed in the void, a festering wound in the Emperor's domain. Helbrecht, ever unyielding, resolved to end it once and for all. Gathering his entire crusade and every sworn Brethren Terminator at his command, he launched an audacious assault on the Hulk, a strike of a scale never before attempted. The assault began with the thunderous crack of teleportation. Black-armored Terminators materialized deep within the Hulk, carving out a perimeter with Storm Bolter and Power Fist, holding the tide of Orcs at bay just long enough for the reinforcements to land. Thunderhawks and boarding torpedoes slammed into the Hulk's hull, disgorging waves of Black Templars into the fray. The battle was immediate, ferocious, and unrelenting. The Terminators were holding fast. They were outnumbered but unbroken, knowing that every moment brought precious time. Then came the second phase. Strike teams fanned out, planting the thermal charges that would rip the Malevolent Dread apart from within. Helbrecht himself, wounded yet undaunted, led the most vital team, pressing ever deeper into the labyrinthian corridors of the Space Hulk. At his side was Vosper, the Emperor's champion, black sword gleaming with righteous fury. The further they advanced, the heavier the resistance grew. The Orcs sensed their doom and threw themselves at the Templars in a last, desperate frenzy. Casualties mounted. Fire lanes were abandoned, choke points lost. And then, deep within the Hulk's twisted interior, the trap was sprung. A cavernous expanse yawned before them. The broken, mist-matched hulls of starships fused together in a nightmarish battlefield. From the shadows, the Orcs surged, thousands of them, heedless of death, crashing into the Templar line with a deafening roar. The bolters of the Black Templars thundered, cutting down greenskins by the score, but still they came. Then the lines broke. The Orcs smashed into the Templars, driving them back in a tide of filth and fury. But even as the battle threatened to consume them, two figures stood unshaken, Helbrecht and the Emperor's champion, Vosper. They led the counterattack with unmatched skill, carving a path through the horde, their their blades felling orc after orc. And then they saw him, the war boss of the Space Hulk. An enormous, brutal monster crashed through the melee, cutting down Black Templars like wheat before the scythe. And it was Vosper who stepped forth to face him. Two warriors clashed, sword against brutal cleaver, a duel of strength and faith against raw, savage might. Vosper fought with all the fury of the Templars, driving the war boss back, striking blow after blow. Victory seemed near, until the beast, in a final surge of rage, battered the champion aside and struck him down. The moment Vosper fell, the battle turned. The Black Templars reeled as the orcs redoubled their assault. Helbrecht himself was dragged down, buried beneath a mass of greenskins. Only the desperate intervention of his command squad saved him, pulling him free, but not before an orc choppa tore into his arm, leaving a grievous wound. The retreat was sounded, but it was a slaughter. With the teleporters aboard Light of Purity failing under the strain, many Black Templars were cut off, trapped aboard the doomed Space Hulk. Left with no escape, they fought to the last, selling their lives as dearly as possible. When the Light of Purity finally pulled away, nearly half of Helbrecht's crusade had been lost. The High Marshal himself teetered on the brink of death, saved only by his enhanced physiology. But even as the battle faded, vengeance burned within his heart. Armageddon was still standing, the orcs stalled by the planet's hellish climate. But Ghazghkull Thraka's flagship, the Perversion of Pain, had fled, vanishing into the void with the remnants of the orc fleet. Helbrecht, his wrath unyielding, swore an oath of vengeance. He would not allow the beast to escape justice. And he would not hunt alone. The hero of Armageddon, Commissar Yarrick himself, came before Helbrecht and made his plea to join the crusade, to see Ghazghkull hunted to the ends of the galaxy. And Helbrecht, recognizing a warrior whose fury burned as bright as his own, granted his request. And so it was that the Black Templars set forth into the void. The hunt for Ghazghkull Thraka had begun. The third Black Templar crusade on Armageddon marched under the banner of a warrior newly burdened with great responsibility. Chaplain Grimaldus, freshly anointed as Reclusiarch after the death of his mentor, Mordred, took up the mantle of leadership with unyielding resolve. Under the command of High Marshal Helbrecht, he led over 100 of his battle brothers into the inferno of war, their path marked by some of the bloodiest battles fought upon the ashen plains of Armageddon. Through a score of brutal campaigns, Grimaldus and his Templars carved a path of victory. But the greatest test awaited them in the beleaguered hive city of Hell's Reach. The city was besieged by thousands of orcs, an endless tide of green-skinned monstrosities that had surged up from the frozen deadlands in the south, carried to war aboard the infernal submersibles of the infamous orc engineer Orchimedes. The siege was relentless. The Battle of Hell's Reach had begun. Grimaldus and his warriors made their stand at the temple of the Emperor's Ascendant, a vast and ancient basilica dedicated to the imperial cult. Its towering spires, a testament to mankind's devotion since the earliest days of Armageddon's colonization. It was there, beneath the hallowed arches of the temple, that the Black Templars chose to defy the Horde. The orcs came like a tidal wave, slamming into the defenders with unrelenting ferocity. For nearly 2 months, Grimaldus and his Astartes stood against the storm. But no defense lasts forever. The green tide finally broke through the temple's walls, pouring into its sacred halls with destructive fury. Irreplaceable relics, treasures of faith and history, were torn apart and shattered beneath their boots, enraging the Templars beyond reason. As the sanctity of the temple was defied, fear spread among the mortal defenders. Hive militants and Imperial guardsmen, their spirits wavering, turned to flee. But then, like the tolling of a great bell, a voice thundered through the chaos. The voice of Chaplain Grimaldus. "I have dug my grave in this place, and I will either triumph or I will die." His words cut through the fear like a blade. The fleeing soldiers turned, courage rekindled by the fire in their chaplain's voice. With renewed fury, the defenders made their stand, meeting the orcs in brutal, close-quarters combat. The temple of the Emperor Ascendant became a charnel house, its grand halls drowned in blood and fire. But the battle could not last forever. The towering basilica, weakened by endless explosions and relentless warfare, finally gave in to the ruin forced upon it. With a terrible groan, the great structure began to collapse, crumbling into dust and burying the combatants beneath its sacred ruins. For a day, all was silent. The temple was lost, entombing both its defenders and their enemies. Many believed Chaplain Grimaldus had perished, another martyr in the long history of the Black Templars. But then, from the wreckage, a lone figure emerged. Grimaldus, battered and bloodied, crawled from the ruins, his armor caked in dust and his body racked with wounds. Yet, in his grasp, he bore the last relics of the temple, carrying them as if the Emperor himself had entrusted them to him. He stood among the wreckage, his voice steady, vowing that the sacrifice of those who had fallen in defense of Armageddon would never be forgotten. Even the apothecaries of the Black Templars, hardened warriors who had seen the limits of human endurance, marveled at his survival. It was as if the Emperor's own hand had guided him from the abyss. When the fires of war finally dimmed and the echoes of battle faded, the people of Hive Hellsreach bestowed a name upon Grimaldus that would never be forgotten: the hero of Hellsreach. The Celestial Lions, scions of the Imperial Fists and the legacy of Primarch Rogel Dorn, stood as a resolute chapter, their lineage forged in unyielding duty. Created during an unnamed founding in the late 38th millennium, they spent the next 4,000 years defending the realms of mankind with unshakable conviction. But even the mightiest warriors are not immune to fate. And for the Celestial Lions, fate had long been set in motion, woven into a tragedy born 5 solar decades before their darkest hour. It began in 948 M41, during what should have been a routine assault on the world of Qatar, and it ended in the Third War for Armageddon, where the chapter stood on the precipice of destruction. The Mannheim Gap was a vast canyon carved into the mountains north of Hive Volcanis, and it was a scar upon the surface of Armageddon, ripped open by the slow churn of the planet's restless tectonics. It was a place where the world never slept, racked by dust storms, ceaseless war, and the ever-present threat of the orc hordes. The Celestial Lions were ordered to strike deep into this ravine. Imperial intelligence had spoken of monstrous war machines, crude gargants being assembled in the depths, their slumbering husks waiting to bring doom to the defenders of Volcanis. The Astra Militarum could not execute the attack. The strike would require speed, precision, and overwhelming force, and only the Lions could deliver such a blow. But the enemy was prepared. Void shields, primitive yet effective, shrouded the orc encampment, making orbital bombardment useless. The Lions would have to attack over land. There would be no drop pods and no aerial insertion. They would march into the depths of the ravine, their tanks at their sides, waging war like the battle lines of the Horus Heresy, an echo of an age-long past. They scouted, they watched, and they confirmed Imperial intelligence. The Gargants lay silent, but time was against them. Every passing solar hour allowed the machines to near completion. There was no alternative. And so 500 Celestial Lions marched to war. 500 Astartes, a force that could have conquered entire worlds, descended into the abyss. They brought their full might to bear, knowing the enemy could not have foreseen such an assault, knowing that no orc warband could withstand the fury of a chapter striking with full force. And they struck hard, seeking to break their foe in a single decisive blow. And it should have worked. But the Gargants were not sleeping. They were waiting. The battle erupted in an inferno of destruction. Las cannons carved through the towering war machines. Gold-plated battle tanks spewed fire into the horde, and war leaders directed their warriors with precision, seeking every weakness, every opportunity to push forward. Even as the enemy stirred, the Lions pressed on, willing to trade their lives for victory. And then, the true trap was sprung. From the depths of the canyon, the greenskins erupted, hordes of them, hidden within tunnels carved into the rock, their war banners decorated with the crucified bodies of fallen lions. Thousands of orcs poured forth, flooding the ravine, turning it into a slaughterhouse. For the Lions there was no retreat. They fought, their blades carving through the tide, their bolters roaring defiantly. War leader Volorark drove his war sword, Jahara, deep into the belly of the Orc warlord, spilling meters of alien entrails into the dirt. But the beast did not fall. And it was then that the final treachery revealed itself. From above, precise, lethal fire rained down. Not the crude, rattling projectiles of the greenskins, but razor-sharp lash shots, fired with a precision that only the Imperium could wield. Snipers, hidden on the canyon walls, picking off the Lion's leaders with cold efficiency. Death speakers, spirit walkers, pride leaders. One by one they fell, their helmets punctured, their commands silenced. The Lions had seen battle in 100 war zones, but never had they faced an enemy so insidious. Somewhere, a traitor had whispered their plans to the foe, and now they paid the price in blood. 4 solar hours was how long it took for the last survivors to cut their way out of the ambush. They left behind a sea of wreckage, destroyed tanks, shattered armor, and the corpses of their fallen and of the greenskin. The gene seed of half the chapter lay rotting in the dust, unharvested and defiled by the greenskins who howled in triumph. This was not a battle, it was a massacre. The survivors fled toward their fortress, pursued by the Xenos. Before they even arrived, the enemy had already overrun their forward base. The Lions had to fight just to escape their own crumbling stronghold. Even as they withdrew, the sky was alight with fire. Gunships rising in desperation, only to be torn from the heavens by Orc artillery. For every ship that made it out, 2 more burned. And by dusk, they had returned to High Volcanus. And only 3 officers remained. Death Speaker Jolkara, who called Reclusiarch Merrick Grimaldus of the Black Templars brother. War Leader Vakempi, the last surviving captain of the chapter. And Lifebinder Ki Tuk, the only apothecary still drawing breath. The future of the chapter rested in his hands. But fate had not finished its cruel work. That very night, in the cold, near lightless foundry that had become the Lion's sanctuary, treachery struck again. At dawn, they found Lifebinder Ki Tuk slumped against a land raider, a single shot piercing his eye lens. The gene seed he had carried was gone. With his death, the Celestial Lions lost more than a warrior. They lost their future. Their fleet was gone. Their armor, their officers, their hope, all lost in the dust of Armageddon. Even their pride had been stripped away, buried beneath the weight of betrayal. All that remained was truth. And the Celestial Lions swore they would live long enough to tell it. The Imperium had to know what had been done to them, who had conspired against them, who had sent them to die. If the chapter could not be revived, then it was only right that they should die with honor. Yet before their last stand, Death Speaker Jolkara sought out a kindred spirit, Reclusiarch Grimaldus of the Black Templars. A fellow son of Dorn, Jolkara hoped Grimaldus could uncover the truth behind their downfall. and ensure that no brother of their shared lineage would ever speak ill of the Celestial Lion's demise. With grim determination, Jolkara dispatched a lone storm eagle from High Volcanus, carrying a desperate plea to the hero of Hell's Reach. The gunship soared through the war-torn skies, seeking Grimaldus, who had recently emerged victorious from the brutal siege of Hive Hellsreach. Still recovering from weeks entombed beneath the rubble of the temple of the Emperor Ascendant, Grimaldus received troubling news. A downed Celestial Lion's gunship had been discovered, its wreckage strewn across the desolate plain. The violent storms of the Season of Fire had claimed it, leaving it a lifeless husk. Determined to uncover the truth, Grimaldus acquired a Valkyrie from the 101st Armageddon Steel Legion Regiment. Braving the lethal winds that scoured the land, he and his chaplain initiate, Cynaric, set out to investigate the crash site. Upon arrival, Grimaldus beheld the ruined gunship. Its colors, once proud, had been stripped away by the storm's fury. Its symbols of allegiance eroded beyond recognition. Smashing through the ship's bulkhead with his Crozius maul, he and Cynaric pressed inside. There, amid the shattered remains of the interior, they found a lone warrior clad in burnished gold, his body twisted in repose against the weapon-racked walls. The sight of the Celestial Lion's armor sent a chill through Grimaldus. Kneeling beside the fallen warrior, he carefully removed the azure helmet. The telltale signs of decay confirmed the warrior had been dead for several solar days. Then, fastened to the Marine's belt, he found a hololithic imagifier the size of a human fist, and with a steady hand, he freed it and activated its memory core. A wavering, flickering image sprang to life, an apparition clad in the heraldry of the Celestial Lions. In its grasp, a skull-faced helmet. The voice that followed was unmistakable, the message undeniable. Death Speaker Jolkara's words carried the weight of betrayal. Grimaldus, they lied to us about the Mannheim Gap. They sent us here to die. Without hesitation, Grimaldus left the crash site, braving the storm once more as they returned to the protective walls of Hive Hellsreach. Within the fortress city, the Reclusiarch secured a private Vox channel to the Eternal Crusader, flagship of the Black Templars High Marshal Helbrecht. When the line was established, he relayed his orders to a chapter serf, instructing him to complete 4 crucial tasks. First, he commanded contact with every Celestial Lion's vessel still in orbit to account for what remained of their war fleet. Second, he demanded a detailed report of all Adeptus Astartes casualties at Hive Volcanus since the war's onset. Third, he required a gunship to return to the Eternal Crusader. If the incoming storm proved too great, they would risk teleportation. And fourth, and the most perilous order, contact the highest-ranking Celestial Lion's officer at High Volcanus. Knowing the transmission would be monitored, he chose his words with care. The message would be simple, yet weighted with meaning. No pity, no remorse, no fear. Upon his return to the Eternal Crusader, Grimaldus met with High Marshal Helbrecht, presenting the hololithic recording. As Jolkar's message played once more, the High Marshal listened in silence. When the image faded, he turned to his reclusiarch, his expression unreadable. Helbrecht asked what Grimaldus hoped to accomplish, and Grimaldus did not hesitate. He wished to establish contact with the Celestial Lions, to understand the full extent of their losses, and, if it was possible, if the Emperor willed it, he sought to punish those responsible for their betrayal. But Helbrecht, ever the strategist, saw the impossible road ahead. To pursue this course meant risking open conflict with the Inquisition itself. Though his warrior's heart burned with the same fury, he knew that justice, no matter how righteous, placed the chapter in peril. He reminded Grimaldus that the Eternal Crusader was set to depart in 3 days, in pursuit of the Orc warlord Ghazghkull Thraka. He could not be allowed to escape. Yet, even as duty called, Helbrecht could not ignore the bitter truth. The Celestial Lions had suffered too great a loss for their fate to be mere coincidence. If they were to perish, the High Marshal wished to hear the truth of their downfall before it was lost to history. And so, he issued a final order. Grimaldus was to go to High Vulcanus and learn the truth before it was too late. Grimaldus and his charge made their way to Armageddon Prime, where the siege of High Vulcanus raged on. The winds were less tainted by the burning sand and ash that plagued the other side of the world. The battered firebase of the Celestial Lions stood atop a natural rise in the landscape. The site, with its towering battlements and sacred statues of fallen Imperial heroes, offered a stark challenge to any who dared approach. But the scene before Grimaldus was one of ruin. The once proud lions now scrambled to gather supplies, loading their Stormhawks with grim efficiency, each warrior keeping one hand free to reach for their bolters at a moment's notice. A lone Space Marine approached, bearing the black helm of a Pride leader. Kneeling before Grimaldus, the warrior removed his helmet, revealing a face marked by the rich brown of equatorial heritage. Though Grimaldus had never set foot on Elysium 9, he recognized the pride of its sons, warriors forged in the same crucible as those of Dorn's bloodline. The warrior introduced himself as Pride leader Akin Dubaku. He explained that he had inherited command from war leader Vakimbi, who had fallen 18 days prior. Grimaldus knew of Vakimbi, an officer of unmatched skill. The Pride leader spoke with a stoic determination as he revealed that only 96 lions still drew breath on Armageddon. Grimaldus inquired about Death Speaker Jolkara, only to learn that the revered leader had been slain by the orcs nearly 24 days ago. The Celestial Lions had fought valiantly, but their fortress had been overrun, and now their only option was to scavenge the remains of their forward base. Ammunition was running dangerously low, and the resupply from their fleet had become all but impossible. Grimaldus wondered why the lions had not sought aid from other chapters, but Dubaku explained their prideful reluctance to beg for help. They had sent word to the Flesh Terrors and the Black Templars, but the former were equally depleted, and the latter were preparing to take the fight to the stars in pursuit of an orc warlord. The lions had not wished to ask for scraps, while others moved forward in pursuit of their own agendas. Grimaldus understood that their pride had cost them dearly. The Celestial Lions had come to Armageddon not just to fight, but to prove themselves worthy of Dorn's bloodline. And now, with the chapter's leadership shattered, they stood on the precipice of annihilation. Grimaldus ordered the lions to finish loading their Thunderhawks, then demanded to know everything that had transpired since their landing. It quickly became clear to the Reclusiarch that the lions had no intention of surviving this world. They meant to die with their brothers in a final, glorious stand. Cynaric, a fellow Black Templar, suggested that the Celestial Lions should return to their homeworld, Elysium 9, to endure the shame of their defeat, much like the Crimson Fists had done after the Battle of Rin's World. There, they could rebuild their chapter and rise again. But the surviving lions scoffed at this idea. Their chapter had been decimated. No men, no material, no knowledge remained to rebuild. To them, fleeing from Armageddon was a coward's move, and they would die as warriors instead. Grimaldus found himself torn. He understood both perspectives. The glorious last stand was noble, but the survival of a chapter was even more precious. Yet, when it came to facing such a sacrifice, would any warrior truly choose to endure shame over a fiery death on the battlefield? As they spoke of their fate, the lions revealed that the Inquisition had had a hand in their demise. Grimaldus listened closely as Dubaku explained how the Inquisition had sabotaged their efforts, used conflicting orders, and orchestrated ambushes to bring the Celestial Lions to ruin. The lions had been the most recent example in the Inquisition's campaign to curb the autonomy of the Adeptus Astartes. The message would be clear. Challenge the Inquisition, and you will pay the price. Few would know the truth of what had transpired, but those few would carry the lesson with them. In the wake of their near destruction, Dubaku spoke of the Mannheim Gap, a well-defended orc stronghold that still needed to be purged. Though many Gargants had been destroyed, the site remained a cancer in High Volcanus' territory. The lions, with what few warriors they had left, were resolved to make a last push. Grimaldus knew that this was nothing more than idealism. The lions, even with their noble resolve, could not hope to take the gap. Dubaku countered that they would die trying, for it was their chosen fate. If they were to die, it would be here, with their brothers' bones beneath them. Grimaldus tried to reason with them. The lions would never succeed on their own, but their survival meant everything to the Imperium. The Reclusiarch argued for preservation, to keep their bloodline intact, to rise again from the ashes, to ensure that the lions were not lost to history. And yet, the Celestial Lions would not hear of it. They wanted a death forged in glory, not the shame of survival. They refused to retreat, and so Grimaldus, though torn, saw no other choice, and was soon struck with a plan. If he could not save the Celestial Lions by traditional means, he would give them the chance to survive. He turned to the Eternal Crusader, where he began to put his audacious plan into motion. Using the ship's powerful communication array, Grimaldus contacted the Imperial forces on the ground and issued a series of orders to Astra Militarum officers. Coordinated the defenses of High Hell's Reach, rallying the soldiers for a counter-offensive. While his actions raised questions among his brothers, Grimaldus remained resolute. He knew that the line's survival depended on a coordinated effort. The Reclusiarch also understood that this would be their only chance. The lions might be denied their glorious death, but they would have the chance to fight again, for the Imperium and for Dorn's legacy. The next day, the Celestial Lions would gather their forces for one final push. They would charge into the Mannheim Gap, prepared to die in battle. But Grimaldus would not allow them to do so without a chance. He had made the decision. He would not let them fade into history as another lost chapter, consumed by pride and folly. The final fate of the Celestial Lions was still to be written, but Grimaldus would ensure that their story would not end in meaningless death. He would fight beside them, and perhaps, with a stroke of luck, they could rise again. The second siege of Mannheim began with a desperate descent into the ruins of Armageddon. Grimaldus had arranged for an Imperial Navy shuttle to carry them to the surface, their shuttle breaking through the clouds just as the first rays of dawn threatened to light the sky. Below, they saw the shattered remnants of the Celestial Lions' stronghold, their fortress now a charred shadow of its former glory. And Grimaldus wondered if the Celestial Lions had already begun their march towards their final stand, abandoning their broken fortifications. As they descended closer to the battlefield, the shuttle passed over a rooftop cluttered with the remnants of the Celestial Lions' once proud fleet. 4 battle-worn Thunderhawks, stripped of paint and dignity, stood motionless next to dozens of rugged, utilitarian troop landers. The landers were a far cry from the grandeur of the Lion's old transport, and even the ground below seemed to reject their presence. Unable to find a suitable, untouched patch of earth, Grimaldus ordered the shuttle to veer away. Black Templars jumped from the ship's rear bay, the jump packs roaring to life as they descended toward the ground. Pride leader Dubaku, who had not expected the Black Templars' return, stood in stunned silence as Grimaldus and Cynaric landed beside him. When Grimaldus explained that the Celestial Lions might appreciate the reinforcements, Dubaku responded with cold suspicion, not welcoming the intrusion of their sacred vendetta. The Pride leader made it clear that when the time came, it would be the Celestial Lion's blade that would bring the Orc warlord responsible for so many deaths to justice. Grimaldus, without hesitation, vowed that it would be so. Within the hour, a war council was called, convened before a battalion of roaring tanks. The plan was simple and grim. They would march into the Mannheim Gap and annihilate all who stood in their path. As they prepared to move out, the air thickened with tension, the weight of the task at hand pressing on every warrior. Dubaku's anger was palpable as he directed his fury toward Grimaldus, accusing the Black Templars of overstepping their bounds. Grimaldus remained firm. His devotion to the Emperor and his fellow warriors gave him the strength to push back against the Lion's resentment. The armies of Armageddon, Imperial Guardsmen, Space Marine, and steel-clad warriors began their march into the heart of the Mannheim Gap. As they descended into the canyon, hope flickered briefly that the enemy might have been weakened. The sight that greeted them was a nightmare of orc destruction. Gargants, the towering orc titans, lay in various stages of repair or reactivation, their massive frames looming over a sea of bodies. Decaying, discarded warriors piled alongside their Xenos foes. The Celestial Lions, once proud, were now reduced to forgotten husks, their ceramite shells of armor defiled and decaying amidst the muck of war. The Imperial forces advanced through the dismal scene, their steps guided by the promise of vengeance. The Imperial Guard fought in grim solidarity, wading through the pools of blood and body parts, their tanks plowing over the remains of comrades and enemies alike. Above them, the remaining Thunderhawks fought to stay in the air, torn at by orc cannon fire. Yet the Steel Legion did not falter. They pressed on, cutting through the orc lines with brutal efficiency, even as their own numbers dwindled with every step. As the battle raged on, Grimaldus found himself face to face with the orc warlord, the one who had haunted the Celestial Lions for so long. The massive beast, a monstrous nightmare of sinewy muscle and brutish power, came at him with unrelenting force. Despite Grimaldus's best efforts with his Crozius, the creature seemed unstoppable, shrugging off even the most lethal of blows. Celestial Lions charged the beast, only to be swatted aside like flies by its mighty claws. Confrontation reached a boiling point as the Pride leader Dubaku finally intervened, challenging the orc in a battle that would determine the fate of the Celestial Lion's honor. With his chainsword, Dubaku danced around the beast's massive attacks, using speed and agility to land blows where he could. But the orc warlord was no easy prey. The battle escalated into a deadly struggle. Dubaku's weapon was not enough to defeat the creature alone, and soon he was bleeding from multiple wounds, his strength dwindling. Then, with the sound of a crackling explosion, the orbital shield protecting the orcs finally failed, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. Grimaldus heard the urgent call from High Marshal Helbrecht. The Black Templars were ready to reinforce their position. Grimaldus gave the order to blacken the sky, signaling the arrival of their reinforcements. But before the High Marshal's forces could arrive, the Pride leader's fate was sealed. In a final, desperate move, the orc warlord grabbed Dubaku and crushed his arm, tearing it from his body with a sickening snap. Grimaldus was quick to act, leaping onto the back of the beast, choking it with the remains of his chains. but even as the orc gasped for air, it did not fall. The fight between the Celestial Lion and the Warlord was not over. It was only when Cyneric tossed a bolter to the Pride Leader that the Celestial Lion fired a single shot, piercing the Orc Warlord's skull, crumbling him to the earth. Dubaku, now a broken and bloodied warrior, lay in the sludge, still alive, but too battered to rise. Despite the grim victory, the battle continued to rage. Grimaldus helped Dubaku to his feet, and the Black Templars arrived in force, descending from the sky in a massive drop-pod assault. Dubaku, now a humbled figure, rose with the help of Grimaldus, determined not to meet the High Marshal while lying prone. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As the dust settled and the Black Templars departed, Grimaldus bid farewell to Chapter Master Dubaku, who now bore the mantle of leadership over the Celestial Lions. Dubaku was a changed man, his body scarred, but his spirit unbroken. He stood tall in the golden armor of the Imperial Fists, a symbol of his new role. At his side hung the skull of the Orc Warlord, a grim trophy of his victory. The Black Templars offered him their farewell, knowing that the Celestial Lions were in capable hands. Grimaldus, though proud of Dubaku's victory, knew that their paths would likely never cross again. The Black Templars would always march onward, seeking the enemies of the Emperor, while Dubaku and his lions would rebuild, holding the line in defense of the Imperium. Thus ended the second siege of Mannheim. For Grimaldus and Dubaku, it marked the beginning of new and uncertain futures. When Wa Gazkul descended upon Armageddon in 998 M41, many Space Marine chapters had rushed to the aid of the beleaguered world, answering the Emperor's call. The Black Templars, the White Scars, Exorcists, Silver Skulls, Iron Champions, and Storm Lords all fought valiantly alongside the Armageddon forces, their heraldry lighting up the battlefield like a storm of banners. Yet, it was the Salamanders, with their deep compassion for the Imperium's people, that left a mark no one could forget. Though they had played a decisive role in Gazkul's defeat during the Second War for Armageddon, the victory came at a tremendous cost. Whether driven by vengeance or by their unyielding sense of duty, the Salamanders made their presence felt even more strongly during the Third War. Under the leadership of their courageous chapter master, Tu Shan, the Salamanders fought with unrelenting determination, bearing the burdens of the most hellish battlefields that Armageddon had ever seen. As the roar of orc warbands began to wane and the initial assault slowed, Salamanders did not rest. Instead, they surged forward, launching brutal counterattacks against the orc rocks that had landed along the Hemlock River. Preferring the close quarters combat within the dark, maze-like tunnels of the rocks to the distant desert clashes. The Salamanders made their mark by the time the season of fire had begun. 9 rocks lay shattered, with countless greenskins sent to their graves by the Salamanders. Yet, while the glory of these battles was shared with many other chapters, it wasn't this alone that made the Salamanders beloved to the people of Armageddon. It wasn't the fire of war or the thirst for glory that drove them. Unlike some who fought for the Emperor's will or their own renown, the Salamanders fought above all to protect the lives of the people of Armageddon. Take, for instance, the battle for Hive Hellsreach. As the skies above Armageddon swirled with orc craft, the Salamander's strike cruiser, Serpentine, descended from the heavens. Sergeant Vareth, leading 70 of his battle brothers, fought alongside the Black Templars, led by Grimaldus. While the Templars waged war with fury and discipline, Vareth and his men focused on one thing above all: protecting the innocent civilians caught in the siege. This approach often clashed with the Black Templars, who felt that such inefficiency hindered their progress. But the Salamanders remained undeterred. Their devotion to saving lives, even at great cost, was unwavering. Throughout the war, Tushan sent his Astartes into the most perilous situations, risking everything to save civilians who might have otherwise been left to the mercy of the orcs. In one of the most notorious episodes, it is said that Tushan came to blows with Captain Vinyar of the Marines Malevolent, after the latter's men shelled a refugee camp simply because it contained orcs. This callous act was in stark contrast to the Salamanders' ethos, and their heroic stand in defense of the helpless only bolstered their renown across the war-torn world. Though the clash between Tushan and Vinyar would leave scars on the relationships between the two chapters, the Salamander's reputation among the people of Armageddon was sealed. As the war drew to a close and the season of fire passed, most of the Salamanders returned to their chapter's sanctum, their part in the war seemingly at an end. Yet their work on Armageddon was far from finished. 2 companies remained behind, safeguarding the planet's major population centers from the constant threat of orc warbands that had not been fully eradicated. The chapter's tech marines, ever dedicated, worked tirelessly to repair and rebuild the vital infrastructure that Armageddon's shattered cities desperately needed to survive. The contributions of the Salamanders may have been quiet and often overlooked. They were no less heroic. It was through their efforts that thousands of lives were saved. The people of Armageddon would never forget the sacrifices made by the sons of Vulcan. Their legend, one of selfless devotion and courage in the face of impossible odds, would grow brighter with every passing year. The conclusion of the Third War for Armageddon remains shrouded in uncertainty. In the end, the conflict was deemed a narrow victory for the Imperium, as the planet remained largely under Imperial control. However, it wasn't until later that word reached Commissar Yarick from the Black Templars fleet orbiting Armageddon that Ghazghkull had fled the world once the season of fire had begun to take its toll, stalling the orc offensives. It was rumored that Ghazghkull had retreated to his command ship, the Perversion of Pain, a space hulk drifting in deep space. Upon hearing this news, Yarick quickly gathered his forces and set off in pursuit, joined by the Black Templars' crusade fleet. High Marshal Helbrecht had already begun a new Imperial crusade, aiming to track down and destroy Gaskell once and for all. Meanwhile, a daring covert operation was launched by the 13th Penal Legion under the command of Colonel Schaefer. The mission was to eliminate the traitorous former planetary governor Hermann von Straub, who had taken refuge in the occupied Hive Acheron. The operation was a trap, as the possessed psyker, Lieutenant Cage, who had aligned himself with von Straub, led the 13th into danger. However, Cage managed to regain enough control over his demonically possessed self to tackle von Straub over the edge of a balcony, both men falling to their deaths and ending the traitor's reign. Though the war officially came to an end, fighting still rages on the planet. Even without Gaskell, who is relentlessly pursued by Yark and the Black Templars, the Orcs remain entrenched on Armageddon. The Orcs now viewed the planet as sort of an eternal battleground, a place where they could always find a worthy foe. This made Armageddon a target for even more greenskins, forcing the Imperium to send in reinforcements just to hold the line and prevent the Orc infestation from spiraling out of control. For the Orcs, the battle had become a legendary event, known as the Big Scrap and Ragnarok. The Orcs arrived by the thousands, drawn by the promise of combat, swelling their ranks daily. The toll on the Imperium was immense, with casualties rising into the billions. Yet the Imperium's resolve was firm. No matter the cost, Armageddon could not be allowed to fall. The situation on Armageddon and the surrounding planets remains dire. Billions of lives lost, and much of the planet's infrastructure in ruins. The scale of devastation wrought by the Third War is unparalleled, leaving the people of Armageddon with scars that may take centuries to heal. Entire Imperial armies were decimated in the fierce combat, and the planet itself suffered catastrophic damage, with construction efforts requiring centuries of labor. Most of the settled planets in the Armageddon system have also been ravaged by the relentless Orc warbands. With Gaskell having fled into deep space, it is feared that he will soon rebuild his forces and forge a new Orc empire, unless Yark and the Black Templars can stop him. The arrival of the Great Rift in 999 M41 brought even more chaos to an already shattered world. As the warp storms unleashed their fury, both sides found themselves isolated, with reinforcements cut off. Those who remained on Armageddon not only faced each other, but also had to contend with waves of chaos demons. In one bizarre twist of fate, desperate moments saw the Orcs and humans fighting side by side against the greater threat. However, such uneasy alliances never lasted long. When the warp storms finally subsided and the Astronomican's beacon shone once again, an Imperial relief force arrived to find the planet irrevocably altered. During the height of the warp storms, demons of Tzeentch and Khorne had waged war upon one another in their eternal rivalry, reshaping the planet's very surface in the process. Half of Armageddon was turned into a twisted landscape, resembling the hellish realms of the demons. The horrors of the warp now intertwined with the ruins of a war-torn hive world. But the Imperial reinforcements, led by the Salamanders and supported by 9 Space Marine chapters, managed to halt a deadly demonic ritual. If successful, the ritual would have brought Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, back to Armageddon, a bitter revenge for the First War. In a desperate bid, the Salamanders and their allies stopped the ritual just in time, preventing Angron's return and protecting the remnants of the Imperial's hold of the world of Armageddon.